Well, greetings everyone, and welcome to the Argonaut monthly video covering November 2024. Well, the event of the month, as we predicted, would be the re-election of the 45th US President, Donald Trump, as the 47th president, winning every swing state and the popular vote, with the emphatic nature of the victory reinforced by the Republican sweep of Senate and Congress. Now, we're going to give our opinion on what we think this means for investors. Many people, even some of our own investors, because we are a broad church at Argonaut, may well disagree with our opinions, but that's really okay because it takes diverging views to make a market, and we are here to make our investors money rather than to proselytize. So, what is the significance of Donald Trump's electoral triumph? And unlike most Hollywood films, will the sequel be any better than the original? So, we're going to look at 5 key aspects: personality, government spending, trade, energy, and the impact on the rest of the world, specifically the UK and Europe. And we're also going to finish with a festive treat, an analysis of why UK electricity prices are so high relative to history and relative to other countries. So it's stating the obvious to say that Trump's personality causes the self-styled great and the good, beyond Penson opinion, to froth at the mouth. Now, we're not sure this is such a bad thing. After all, Britain's only great peacetime prime minister since the 19th century, Margaret Thatcher, had the same effect, and her private morals were exemplary. Now, recent Conservative governments have campaigned in the UK on a reforming agenda only to lose their way because they cared too much about what the expert class thought about them. It is therefore both, in my opinion, both inevitable and unavoidable that any politician serious about fighting the blob and affecting political change will be labelled divisive. And Trump's cabinet appointments have also demonstrated, I think, that he is in a better position now than in 2016 to drain the swamp. So I think as investors, we should think that Trump will do what he says and will do it more effectively than what he did in his previous term. Now, inspired by the example of Argentina, where President Milei has cut government spending by 1/3 in just 12 months, the new Trump administration will, according to Elon Musk, target $2 trillion or 7% of GDP of federal government budget, though this figure has subsequently been revised down to an initial $500 billion. But that this is being attempted from a position whereby US federal spending is just 24% of GDP, state spending is another 11%, puts UK and French government spending at 46 and 58% of GDP into its truly ruinous perspective. And whilst the Biden administration ran outrageous peacetime deficits, new Treasury Secretary Bessent has already pledged to deliver a 3% budget deficit versus the current 7%, with 3% GDP growth and delivery from the new Department of Government Efficiency. We think this is credible. Now, if this cost cutting involves the elimination of non-jobs or very low productivity jobs relative to pay, it is not, in our view, negative for the economy, since this labour will be employed more productively elsewhere and also offset less supply from immigration. The new Trump administration is also proposing to return to the standard Republican policy from the 19th century of using trade tariffs to protect manufacturing and to fund government, proposing to cut corporate tax from 19 to 15% of GDP through the imposition of a 10 to 20% across-the-board tariff and 60% on China. Now, such a move is likely to incentivize foreign companies to own manufacturing assets in and increase capital flows to America, whilst also resulting in Chinese exports, which would have gone to America, being dumped in Europe, hastening the process of European deindustrialization. Of course, it remains to be seen the degree to which the threat of tariffs is a negotiating ploy. Nevertheless, even the threat of import tariffs is positive in our view for US dollar demand. Now, whilst incoming Treasury Secretary Bessent has suggested that the US aim to increase oil production from its current 12 million barrels per day to 15, Trump's energy policies will, in our opinion, provide more of a boost to the natural gas industry, where the absence of pipeline infrastructure and the moratorium on further LNG exports prevents the monetization of stranded shale gas, where America currently produces the equivalent energy of 20 million barrels of oil. Now, this abundance manifests in Henry Hub gas, the benchmark price for US natural gas, currently trading at just $3 per gigajoule versus European gas, TTF, at $12 per gigajoule, and crude oil, which is actually cheaper than European gas, at $11 to $12 per gigajoule. For context, the last UK offshore wind auction at £100 per megawatt hour is the equivalent of $22 per gigajoule, so ruinously expensive versus Henry Hub gas. So we power our economy at $22 per gigajoule. America powers its economy at just 3. Henry Hub is the world's cheapest source, not only of reliable energy, but energy full stop. And this need for cheap and reliable energy for AI data centers is also very bullish for natural gas. OpenAI is talking about building 5 gigawatt data centers. And if all of Britain's electricity were exclusively used to power 5 gigawatt data centers, the UK could manage to power just 6.5. Now, with UK electricity prices the highest in the world, which we'll talk about later, and 3 times those in the US, it is hard to avoid the conclusion that most of the world's AI data centers will be built in the US and hardly any in the UK. Now, estimates which we think are credible of 150 gigawatts of incremental power demand from AI data centers globally by 2030 would equate to 1,300 terawatt hours annually. That's 4.5 times UK current electricity generation and just 1/3 of US electricity generation. And our calculations suggest that LNG exports, incremental LNG exports, and AI demand is likely to add about 20 to 30% to US gas demand for Henry Hub over the next 5 years, resulting in a higher price. Now, at the time of the financial crisis in 2008, standards of living in the US, UK, France, and Germany were roughly comparable. But since then, whilst GDP per capita in the US has risen from $48,000 to $78,000, it has remained stagnant for 15 years in Western Europe. And we wonder why our society is failing. I suggest that our politicians' pay is linked to GDP per capita, our standards of living. Coincidentally, the shale revolution began in the US in 2007 and is now responsible for 64% of all US crude and 78% of all natural gas production. But blinded by the woke mind virus, Europe ploughs on regardless with its failed business model, its expensive and unreliable energy, and its worship of the state rather than the entrepreneur as the allocator of capital and facilitator of economic growth. This manifests in the assisted suicide of its industrial base and its inability to defend its continent without American support from the military might of a Russian pygmy economy. Now, the re-election of Donald Trump is truly a disaster for Europe's smug political class. It will highlight their generational abject failure, which should inspire the peasants to revolt. Now, a few years ago, we wrote about the prospect of the 1970s redux. We now see that we were wrong, insofar as although we have all the worst aspects of the 1970s, we did that generation a disservice. in that they at least understood the importance of cheap and reliable energy. In the UK in the 70s, this led to the development of North Sea oil and gas, replacing coal, which was unreliable, not because of its physical properties, but because it was produced by unreliable unionised workers who held the country to economic ransom in 1974. We're often intrigued as to how many successful fund managers studied history at university. A grasp of history is useful for investing in many ways, but primarily because how people behaved in the past is the best guide to how they will likely behave in the future. To our mind, the election of Donald Trump has echoes of Ronald Reagan in 1980 or even 1984.
It's morning again in America.
But the historic analogue for Britain seems stuck at 1974, with the hope that after 5 years of hard labour, we might just decide that the economic model for post-Brexit Britain is indeed America rather than Europe. Now, there's been another cold spell over London, and robbed of our winter fuel allowance, we've had to make economies by turning down the thermostat. But how expensive is Britain's electricity prices and why are they so high? Now, the net zero establishment would have you believe that our electricity prices are high because of Putin's war in Ukraine. I must tell you now that this explanation does not cut the mustard. We've already seen how US Henry Hub gas is a fraction of the price of European TTF gas, but the European gas price is now down some 90% from its peak after its initial war spike in 2022. Putin can be blamed for many things, but he cannot be blamed for our high electricity prices. Earlier, we showed you that the UK's electricity price for industrial customers was the highest in the world, 80% above median and 3 times the price in the US. This means that if there are any energy-intensive industries like fertilizer, steel, aluminium, or data centers left, they won't continue to be in Britain for very long. But let's now look at retail electricity prices after tax, the price you and I pay to power our homes. As you can see, although these have been higher than American prices for the last 25 years, they started to diverge from the average price in 2018 and are now even higher than Germany's, the highest in the world. Now, at the time of the 2008 Climate Act, which committed the UK to reduce CO2 emissions by 80% by 2050, the UK electricity price was just 12 pence per kilowatt hour, in line with the average. At the time of the 2019 amendment, which committed into statute net zero by 2050, the UK electricity price had risen to 18 pence per kilowatt hour. Today, it is 35 pence per kilowatt hour, up 300% since 2008 and 100% since 2019. So even though retail electricity prices have not increased as much as industrial prices, each time that the UK government has introduced climate change legislation, they have doubled and then doubled again. Let's look at this in a longer term perspective by looking at UK electricity prices since 1920 and look at it against the share of renewable power, including hydro, biomass, wind, solar. We see that the market share of renewables is under 5% until 2011, when the electricity price is just 10 pence per kilowatt hour. But since then, total renewable share has now increased to 42%, whilst the electricity price is now 35p per kilowatt hour. That's an average annual increase in UK domestic electricity prices of over 10% since 2011, where for the previous 90 years, the average annual increase was just 2% per annum. So climate change legislation has been a disaster for UK consumers of electricity. As a result of high electricity prices, UK consumption of electricity has already decreased by 26% from its 2005 peak, and on a per capita basis is now back to the same level as in 1972. Given the strong historic link between GDP per capita and energy use, is it any wonder that UK standards of living have remained at the same level since 2008 when the Climate Change Act was first introduced? Now, as many people struggle to heat their homes this Christmas, this is something for so-called ethical investors, if indeed they can think for themselves, to ponder. This video will be the last of 2024 and we will return in January. All that remains is for us at Argonaut to wish you and your kin tidings of comfort and of joy.